everyone, Dr. Jason Old here, surfer, historian, world traveler, and your host of the Surfing Historian podcast. This season, we'll be diving deeper into the nuanced world of surfing and examining the historical, cultural, philosophical, and even scientific elements of the sport we're all stoked on. So let's paddle out together and ride through the world of academia. This episode is sponsored by Banana Bag Oral Solution. These are definitely not your typical dehydration supplement. In fact, they're my personal go-to after a long surf session when I'm looking to avoid exhaustion and dehydration. Check them out at bananabag.org and use promo code STAYSTOKED for 10% off your purchase. You'll also get free shipping if you join their mailing list.
Joining me today from Tampa, Florida is historian and your very own host of the Surfing Historian podcast, Dr. Jason Old. Jason is a Spanish and history professor at Southeastern University. Today, we will be talking about his research on the surfing history of Nicaragua, as well as his dissertation, The Politics of Waves, a transnational and cultural surfing history of Popoyo, Nicaragua. Jason's research has three principal aims. First, to show how external conditions created an economic framework conducive to buying property and developing this part of Nicaragua. Second, to explain the link between surfing and Tola's transformation from a coastal periphery to an international tourism hotspot. Third, to track the proliferation of a robust surfing subculture among Tola's rural residents, as well as surfing's evolution into a Nicaraguan national sport. I've known Jason for quite some time, so as the producer of this podcast, I'm super stoked to be able to interview him and allow him to finally formally share his research with our listeners. But before we get started, I wanted to personally thank you, Jason, as well as our listeners for being a part of this special episode of The Surfing Historian.
Yeah, Taylor, thank you so much for, in a sense, doing a bit of role reversal and interviewing me about my research. You as the producer, we've been together on this project for, a season and a half almost. And, who better to interview me than the person that's been helping me push this podcast out around the world. So, thank you so much.
Yeah, man, I'm so stoked to be able to sit down with you and in front of the acoustic camera, so to speak, here, be able to ask some questions about your research. It's been so intricately tied to the many amazing guests that we've been able to interview and share the stories of. And I'm personally really excited to finally have your story coming out and being able to be shared by and celebrated by our listeners here too. Because your research has turned up some really interesting data and interesting stories that I think the world needs to hear. So thanks for agreeing to sit down and be my victim. Interviewee.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, this is, again, it's strange to be on the interviewee side of things. So, but yeah, let's do this.
Let's dive in. So speaking of personal connections and personal stories, let's talk a little bit about what brought you, Jason Old, now Dr. Jason Old, into the academic and professional world of surfing, where a lot of the public doesn't know there is a collision between, the true intellectual pursuit of the waves combined with, a deep personal draw to the waves from, a philosophic angle. What compelled you to dive years of your life into this world?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I've always surfed. Well, I started probably surfing as, early teenager, I guess.
Right.
So surfing has always been a part of my life. And, as I got a little older, I started to travel and surf. So, the surfing component isn't, that was always there. But as I traveled the world, and more specifically, one place in particular, really, I would have never predicted this in a million years. But, when I worked as a surf guide in Nicaragua back in 2004, 2005, I just fell in love with the place. And, as I came back and I started working as a university professor and then later on, pursuing my, PhD in history, I actually, what I wanted to do initially was look at sort of the Nicaragua and Cuban revolutions and sort of dig more into that. But my committee advisor, one of them, I was sitting with her in her office, and she actually kind of put forth the idea of doing essentially, what I would define as a surfing history of Nicaragua. And among many, many other things, she's, also a sports historian. So she kind of saw this emerging field that you were just asking about. And it's, it is a very nascent field, but people have been putting out scholarship for, since the early 2000s, 2010s, I should say. But all of that, and many of whom I interview on the podcast and have spoken to, we interviewed on the season one. A lot of those individuals really helped legitimize what I eventually wrote as my PhD dissertation, which, as you stated in the intro, it's a transnational and cultural surfing history of Popoyo, Nicaragua. So really, I just fused together the sport I love and a discipline I love, which is history. And of course, at first for me, I was like, oh yeah, cool. I'm going to write this story of, everybody, my friends in Nicaragua and this and that. And of course, my committee made sure that didn't happen. That, I was very objective, including being quite critical of the role we've played in this development. So
right on.
Yeah, and so that was really, they guided me along the way to make it a very tightly well written and tightly woven academic piece that wove surfing into it. And so we use, like many of the other people we interview, we use surfing as a lens to view certain elements. In my case, the history of Nicaragua. And others that we bring on look at it through a more economic framework, a tourism framework. So yeah, for me, I just, thanks to all of those that came before me and the advice of my committee chair and the help of my committee, I was able to put this thing together, and something that I'm very proud of. And just the stories that emerged as I was writing it really were beautiful, honestly. Many, many of them.
Dude, that's amazing. I mean, that's important work. Being able to overlay this new filter of the deep beauty and significant impact that the art form and sport of surfing has into the development of an entire region, if not country. I think it's amazing that you were able to follow your intuition and follow into a somewhat uncharted path, with just a few flags in the ground from some of the entrepreneurs before you, intellectual entrepreneurs before you, and find a story that was personal to you, that really resonated with you. I've had the privilege of hearing about this as your friend over the years, but as we've been doing more of this podcast together, and as I've heard more of stories of your colleagues, I really realized exactly how important that word critical is in what you mentioned here, having critical surf studies and being able to look with an honest and sometimes raw lens of the impact that surfing has had in some of these regions that had never heard of or seen surfing before, and your dissertation is a platform now that's being able to elevate these voices that haven't been heard before and tell these stories that I think not just the surfing community, but even those of us who are outside of the surfing community are impacted by. So I'm so grateful to be able to hear about some of these stories with you here. I'd like to jump into the work that you did and the research that you did, and kind of focus a little bit on that critical element. So when you started, obviously you came through the lens of the love of surfing, but what did you start noticing that was more on the critical side here that you weren't expecting at first?
Taylor, that's just a really, really great question, and thank you for that. Well, I guess it's, kind of put simply, it's why I titled the dissertation "The Politics of Waves." I went into this, I would say, somewhat naive. But as I dug into did my archival research, which is, a methodology among others that we do as historians, looking at online resources, other resources, I realized this place that I just saw as, a place that grew in popularity as a surf zone, let's say. Um, it was I didn't realize all the politics that went into that area, whether it was as a result of the revolution and the agrarian reform, or subsequent presidents, more of the neoliberal presidents that came about, them, um, you know, grabbing land, or creating land in places, like I talk about, under Arnaldo Aleman. He actually created, kind of extended the Wasakate Peninsula, and in doing so, you uh, put rubble over top of the mangroves, but it actually extended the peninsula, and now it's home to, you know restaurants, hotels, all of that. And so, again, he wasn't necessarily doing that for the future of surf tourism. He was doing it for, as the research showed, let's say, more selfish or self-serving motivations. But nevertheless, things like that, like, even having lived there and seen how things evolved, let's say, there was just so much I didn't know. And so that's the one of the more critical components, I guess, to answer your question. But another one that I, you know, sort of piggybacking on other scholars that came before me and have done incredible work on this, I looked at, I say myself as an active participant, as what we call surf settler colonialism. And, that's essentially what it sounds like. And, surfers, foreign surfers, moving into these spaces, these coastal spaces that were historically rural, buying land inexpensively in and around the waves. And it all sort of centers around the waves. And so, viewing me purchasing land and friends purchasing land, and that the transformation of this place into a surf tourism epicenter, or surf tourism hotspot, it was another frame, I viewed it more critically than I had before. And that's not to suggest it was all bad. It's just viewing things more analytically, and objectively, in terms of the impacts of this influx of foreigners who come there to buy land or to start businesses, or whatever. So yeah, I would say those two certainly are examples of how I viewed this transformation, from a rural periphery to a what I call a international surf tourism epicenter. And so I was able to look through that through a more critical lens. And so that was, hopefully that answered your question.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, being able to see the two different sides of not just the physical land itself and how the land interacted with the waves changing, but what the culture there is like. I would love to hear more about some of the stories in that second piece of the surfing colonialism, essentially. What did that transformation look like? How did that impact the people of Popoyo from before and after this transformation? And keeping in the critical mindset, analytically, what was the good and the bad?
I forget it specifically. I think that's chapter 3, which is, I think, my longest chapter. I really, really dig into that one. And really it's, one of the people, well, the individual, he and his first wife, JJ Yema and Kim Yema, they actually started the first all-inclusive surf camp in Nicaragua in 1999, called Popoyo Surf Lodge, I worked there in 2004, which is really what, allowed me to engage with the community and just see what was going on, because I knew very little at the time. But yeah, JJ came in the late 90s, 97. And, this is after, 7 years after the conflict ends, right? And so there was still a lot of apprehension, but, one of the things JJ told me about as we were doing our interview was, a lot of people do this, they call it like a visa run, right? So they'll come from, say they're living in Costa Rica, as their visa is about to run out, they'll shoot across the border to Nicaragua, stay a night, and then go back to Costa Rica. That's a very common thing. That's not, you know, he doing that and many others. That's not an anomaly. That's, essentially what the way people do it that are many expats that are living there who aren't residents. So
fascinating.
Yeah. So, we call it just a visa run, right? And, and so, JJ did that, and this was, like I said, 97, and somebody had told him about Popoyo, and, he and I were talking sort of jokingly. He's like, I didn't even know what a Popoyo was, because, you got to check out Popoyo. So anyways, all that to say, he and his buddy took a taxi ride, from essentially San Juan del Sur, which is where most people back then were doing the visa run. It's the town, the city across the border from Costa Rica, which used to historically be a shipping and fishing place. Like, fishing was important, along the coast. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But, very, very long story short, they get dropped off essentially in the middle of nowhere in the town of Las Salinas de Nahualapa, which is it's inland from, Popoyo, what everyone now calls Popoyo. And, it was very indigenous, a highly indigenous area, where people historically, either worked, within the orbit of the agro industry, with cattle and things like that. And so very, very rural, highly indigenous. In fact, the people of Las Salinas de Nahualapa and probably Tola more broadly are descendants of the the indigenous groups of central Mexico. And so, in the town name Nahualapa, you have Nahua, right? Which is Nahuatl was the language of the Aztecs. So they're descendants of those groups, the central Mexican groups. But anyway, so that's, I think you used the word clash at some point, but so right there you have foreigners coming into this highly indigenous space, and it just so happens that Popoyo and many parts of that coastline have epic surfing conditions. So you now have the ability to buy land, very much more economically favorable than Costa Rica at the time. It's uncrowded. I mean, there was no one surfing there. And so, there was a couple locals that had, in the past surfed, but there wasn't the robust surfing culture that exists today. And so that was very much a result of this surf settler colonialism that you're asking about. And so JJ and then a number of others, JJ, he relates to my story because I end up buying land from him, as do many, many other expats. And so he buys land from one of the locals, and there's a lot to the story, but, sort of in fast forward, if you will, buys land and then starts a surf camp. And then as guests come to the camp and, they're just absolutely floored at the amazing waves and the fact that you can buy land now under the new neoliberal governments who, privatization was a key component to these neoliberal governments that started in 1990 with Villa Chamorro. But so I'm one of those individuals who bought land, and I, like many others, did that. And then over time, people start building houses and things like that. And that's the sort of the colonial element of it, where you're buying land that was historically owned by, or redistributed actually, by many of these individuals. And then foreigners come in and start buying the land prices go up, and, that does have negative impacts too. And this would be for another podcast, just talking about the nuances of the agrarian reform and some of the laws that were passed after the Sandinistas lost in the elections, which made titling property titles, the whole system very convoluted. So, which led to conflicts over land and different things like that. And so, it's just that's kind of to back to your question about serf settler colonialism. It's this outside group coming in, in this case for surfing. That's why I, like many others, say serf settler colonialism. And then what ensues as a result of this colonialism, let's say. And again, a lot of people here listening to this are like, oh, well, that's such a bad word. Like colonialism has such baggage to it, but it's nuanced, and people like my good friend Lindsay Usher has done incredible work on local perception of this transformation. And so, I would recommend checking out what she's written about this process as well. But yeah, and so there's a number, again, to not go on and on and on about it. Another thing that other scholars write about is water insecurity, and much of that is attributed to of course, climate change. There's longer droughts, wells dry up, but you also have, as tourism expands, you have more people pulling from the same water source. And so as foreigners are, say, watering their gardens or taking longer showers, that's having an impact on the aquifer, essentially. And that, it can, in a long drought season, can, have a negative impact on the locals' access to quality water.
Wow.
So there's a whole lot to it. And that's why the dissertation is so long. And I honestly just scratched the surface. I really, to be honest with you, my work, and a lot of people have written me and said, like, thank you for this local history and all this.
Cool.
I'm very, very grateful to have had the opportunity to write this, but this is just, a starting point for future scholars. Like I've scratched the surface, as have a number of others who do incredible work in the area. And, for me, I just want this to be just this, like I said, the starting point, the point of departure for all the future historians that want to look into this, and other scholars too.
Hell yeah. That's amazing. So, I mean, I can see you're getting kind of jazzed when you're thinking about some of these stories that you were able to capture from some of these locals. Give me your top story. What's your favorite story that you've been told, just as you feel it right now, not of all time? I can only ask you in the moment. What in this today? What have you been feeling that's been standing out to you as particularly inspiring?
As I'm listening to you ask that question, there's two things that come to mind. A more broader story, which revealed itself as I was writing this, and that's the surfing subculture among the locals that emerged as a result of this. And I think that is probably one of the most beautiful parts to this story. How it was a sport that was introduced by foreigners in much of the same way, at least in Nicaragua, baseball and boxing were two of their biggest national sports. Surfing comes around and is introduced through varying forms of what I call American imperialism. But the locals being so athletic and just, incredibly gifted, and in many cases, incredibly comfortable around the water too. They, adopted the sport. And at this point, now we're in 2023, but, I end the story in 2020 because that's when it officially becomes a national sport. But it's that story of the young local Nicaraguans from these economically disadvantaged rural coastal communities just getting brought into the surf tourism orbit, learning to surf, and at this point, I'll just say it, dominating the lineups.
Nice.
Just their proficiency on the waves now is, they own the waves. And I think that's the beautiful story that for me emerged above and beyond, some of the political stuff and whatnot. Just that's the arc for me. That's the beautiful part of this story, and how it is now, you know, part of their culture. It's not seen as necessarily this foreign thing, but you know, they have surf clubs, they have national teams, they have, and so just to see that how it's ultimately benefited them in many ways is something that uh, revealed itself to me as I was doing all this research. But I'll add one more thing. Um, One of the people that I talk about, and he's a longtime friend, is my friend Jamil. And Jamil is, for me, embodies, he was just old enough to, when I was there, he was working in the kitchen, couldn't speak English, couldn't drive, um, was an okay surfer. I mean, he was fairly, I say fairly new to the sport. Like now he's an incredible surfer and has been for a very long time. Um, but, um, but back then he was, just sort of getting into the sport, getting in sort of in that orbit, and was very instrumental. He and his family were extremely instrumental in helping people like JJ and others, um, bring this camp, if you will, in many respects to fruition. So, but Jamil for me, and I'll just kind of add this really quickly, he's somebody who really for me embodies this transformation. Somebody who, like I said, was working in the kitchen, washing dishes at the surf camp, Popoyo Surf Lodge. Couldn't speak English, couldn't drive, you know, could surf, could paddle out, but now he is um, effectively, you know, helping run Popoyo Surf Lodge. He speaks perfect English. He's married to an expat, and they have a beautiful kid. He drives. He drives the four-wheel drives. He drives the boats. He's an insanely amazing fisherman too. And so he, for me, embodies this story. And so I think that probably answered your question a little bit better. So that's a story for sure that, really also revealed itself. And I knew that story. Jamil, I've watched this happen. So that's another really cool story, I think.
That's amazing, because not only is this a real story of a real human being, but it sounds like Jamil helped to inspire your scholarship as well. Like, watching his transformation and watching his growth, and the way that he's representing the people of Popoyo, and how you realize there's an authentic and deep, greater story here that needs to be told that isn't just Jamil.
Yeah, and Jamil is one example. I could rattle off a number of people from that community who not only not only embody this change and were young enough to really they were old enough, but yet still young enough to really embrace it, right? And so, like I said, I could rattle off a number of them. My buddy Errol Lopez is another example who, same thing, worked at the surf camps. I believe he was at Safari Charters, which was adjacent to JJ's. That's Safari Charters is my buddy Lance's place, who, again, another person that was very helpful in putting together, finding surfing magazines in the early 2000s that wrote about the area. And so it's really everybody. I couldn't have done this without all of them. And I hope, if I haven't told them personally, which I'm pretty sure I have, I'm formally telling you all through this podcast. Thank you all so much. But Errol, just kind of quickly about Errol, again, someone who worked at the camp, learned English, now married to an expatriate, again, has a beautiful, beautiful child, and has started a local surf, essentially a local surf tourism outfit. I think calls it a local movement. And so it's very much by locals to cater to and guide foreigners to surf spots and do a whole host of stuff. And so, I think that for me, and again, because we were talking about surf settler colonialism, and that comes across I think that word and that language can be abrasive, particularly to it. Many foreigners in these places may feel like they're being, and I would say myself too, like, well, I'm pointing the finger at them and I'm not. I'm saying, as you said about the critical surf studies as a field, we're just looking at this more objectively, and again, to not harp on sort of the negative stuff. And to answer your question, like, I think those individuals really embody a more positive, some of the more positive components and elements of this surf tourism model that now exists, I would say, in full force in that area.
Cool. So I'm fascinated about this local surfing subculture that you're seeing form and that you've seen form over the years and is still forming today. You mentioned that it's really become something that isn't a foreign practice, but that has been authentically absorbed into the culture of Popoyo. What special flavors of Popoyo do you see coming out in the surfing culture there? You know, as somebody who has surfed many places and has come from a different culture in your surfing originally, how do you see Popoyo impacting surfing, both on the local and the international levels?
Wow, Taylor, that I didn't see that question coming. That's a good one. So there's a couple of things. One, my buddy Scott Latterman has written an incredible piece, incredible book, Empire and Waves, that looks at how surfing, the modern surfing culture that we think about today, and there's others who've written incredible books, but Scott's a buddy of mine, and that book is one of my favorites. But looking at how surfing in the modern era was sort of diffused or proliferated as a result of the spread of American empire. And so I'm kind of giving you that bit of information to then say, because you ask about what's unique about Nicaragua. Well, there's some unique elements, but there's also some more commonalities that you see around the world, right? I mean, surfing in and of itself, everybody shares a particular, like, there's certain things about surfing that we all share around the world, right? Cool. Now you may be surfing at Cocoa Beach or Satellite Beach on a beach break, or you could be at Uluwatu in Bali on a reef break. So obviously waves are different, but there's certain things. The shaka seems to be ubiquitous. Just certain elements of wave riding, modern day wave riding in and of itself. So I don't necessarily think that in Popoyo, I guess let me back up and say this. In Popoyo now, because of the spread of modern surfing culture, which is largely due to, big brands from Australia and the US, you see that's the ubiquitous part of it, right? You see, locals walking around with, let's say rainbow sandals, right? Or a Billabong shirt, or the surf trunks they wear are going to be Rip Curl or something. So those brands are so massive. It's like going to a soccer field and seeing Nike and Adidas, right? So those brands and that's the style is what kind of binds surfers around the world too. I mean, even you could go to Kansas and someone's wearing, some Billabong trunks, and it's like those are surf shorts, right? So there's certain, and I do talk about these big brands as well in the dissertation, but one of the things that I would say makes Popoyo in that Tola municipality, and I would say Nica more broadly now because so many people surf along the coast. One of the things that I think is unique, and it's probably not uniquely Popoyo, and there's probably others around the world that do this, but something that I always found super, super fascinating, super cool, and I loved watching my, local friends do, was they would, in some cases, bring out a hand line, a fishing line. I have a photo that I use in the dissertation of my buddy, Juancito, who's getting barreled. He's literally sitting super comfortably in a barrel, and in his mouth is a hand line for fishing. And so my buddy Gerald, local Nicaraguan photographer, took that photo, and I'm not going to say where it was taken, but that for me, or seeing my friends sit out there with one of the little spaghetti strap bags and casting, sitting on a longboard, casting out behind the breakers, behind the waves, and then as a set comes, they would catch a set wave and then paddle back out and keep fishing. So that's definitely not something I do when I'm surfing, say on the east coast of Florida, or I don't see many Californians doing that, or others. So I would say that's something that's I found I really thought it was cool how they, and I write about this, how they appropriated surfing in a sense, but also, to your question, made it uniquely theirs, right? And that's I think that's answering your question, how they have woven this history of fishing together with this newfound passion for surfing. And so it's not like they abandoned fishing to start surfing. They've connected the two, and now the craft they use to fish off of is just a longboard. And so,
dude,
apart from that, watching some of them surf on their my buddy Wicho, like watching him like dance on this longboard on big waves, like I can imagine some of the Hawaiians doing that as well, like just dancing on these massive waves, no fear, and just it's like they are one with the ocean. And so again, to kind of, in short, there are certain ubiquitous elements, the style and all of that you see around the world, but it's these little pockets like Popoyo that are fishing first, that have then embraced surfing, and then you see them weave these two cultures together. And so I think that's probably something that's unique to them as well.
Fascinating. Especially that speaks to me. My background is in entrepreneurship. I know a lot of the listeners don't know this about me, but I do carry a master's in entrepreneurship. And as part of my training, what they always have us look for are what are considered aptly named blue ocean strategies, where you're looking for a space in the consumer market or in the business market that hasn't been bloodied by competition. The waters are still blue and clear and not red. And one of the strategies that you look for to identify these so-called blue oceans are intersections of user stories that have never been tried before. And so I hear something like, here's a culture whose business is primarily centered around fishing, learning new art forms, learning new sports forms, learning new skills, and then combining that in ways that haven't been seen before to create something new, to create a literal blue ocean. So I just get really jazzed to hear that, because it's like the beautiful unification of art and business. I've heard you mention a couple times that there have been some new land developments and new businesses. Can you speak more to that entrepreneurial nature that's clearly come through the art of surfing as well?
Yeah, and I will say this, because as you were talking about your comments you were just making, I was thinking, just to give one more example, and again, all of my friends and others who are listening from Nicaragua are very familiar with this. They surf there every day. They're like, oh man, you probably, they're probably thinking like, man, you left out, this and that. And so one of the other things I will mention that I found really, another thing I found really intriguing as I sort of dug into this was, again, the locals are very much, the beach is very much part of their ancestral lands, right?
Wow.
And which includes myths and other things about little hobgoblins living underneath like one of the rock outcroppings and things like that. And so I write about that as well. So they even call, las playas del pueblo, the beaches of the people. And so one of the examples I want to give you along those lines is this rock outcropping that is now surfers now know as outer reef. Well, outer reef is really only surfable at high tide, certain swell size, certain swell direction, et cetera, et cetera. But it's, some would have referred to it as the pipeline of Central America. And it's a heavy wave, and it has now become world renowned. But at low tide, the rock outcropping is exposed, and the locals have historically called it el astral. So it's just this sort of rock outcropping where they'll walk out on and fish from. And so, or catch things that are stuck in sort of the little tidal pools or whatever. But if you walk out to the edge of it or walk out far enough, you can cast off into deeper waters, which is what those deeper waters running, head first into that rock outcropping is what makes the barreling wave for the, again, I'm not that's not my area of expertise to like dissect how waves form, but it's so on the high tide, when the conditions are right, it's this perfect barreling world-class wave that, like I said, some have compared with, Pipeline and, North Shore of Oahu. But at the low tide, it has provided a space for locals to fish. And so again, just seeing that in real time, let's say, is always such a beautiful, beautiful thing. And, apart from that, it's just a beautiful beach. It's a beautiful place. And, but I guess to your point, you were, asking about businesses. Naturally, as the surf settler colonialism does what it does and people gravitate to these areas, you do see a lot of expat businesses. And I write about those. Many of them are very good friends of mine and have created, whether it's a surf camp or a surf shop where they're doing ding repair and things like that. Some have started restaurants. But one of the things that sort of at a local level, local resident level, let's say, Nika level, is many locals have started restaurants. And I think it's really, what I think is really amazing about that as well is you see it frequented by foreigners, right? Like I'm on a Popoyo social Facebook page, and you see a lot of stuff that's like support local, do this, do that. And so, and again, couple my favorite spots, right there by Popoyo, sort of, right up behind the wave, about 2 kilometers or something. There's a place where they make killer fish tacos. La Loma del Sabor is the name. So I'm putting a little plug in for them. But, it's a place that if you show up at any given time, lunch, dinner, you will find that it's heavily trafficked by foreigners. And so it's locally run. It's run by a number of women from the local community, and they, very fresh, very tasty. And, the expats, the tourists and all that I feel like I eat there every day when I'm there. And so,
I've heard you talk about this restaurant for years, man.
Yeah.
These are legendary tacos in our friend circle.
Yeah, that, and I'll put another little shameless plug out, Asados El Bosque, which is right there before you get into Las Salinas. Again, another place run by a local family, and it's a great place for food, and again, you can go there. You'll see a mix of locals eating there because it's, the prices are pretty favorable, but then you'll see many of us sitting there eating. And again, you see these, and I mentioned Errol's business earlier, where he is, obviously well-versed in surfing, knows that place inside and out, born and raised there, and now has created a business to cater to foreign surfers. I could go on and on and on. You have now local surf photographers. I mentioned Gerald, who took that photo I was mentioning of Juancito. So you have, and he works now for Popoyo Surf Lodge. So you have these individuals that really embraced this new economy, for better, for worse. They embraced it. Another group are locals that are giving surf lessons, right? So they've been able to capitalize on the fact that people come and want to learn to surf. So they've set up a little essentially a tent structure right outside of this really good place for learning to surf. And you've got and the last one I'll mention, my friend Jesse Amador. He's a surfboard shaper. He is the first, to my knowledge, Nicaraguan surfboard shaper, and he's making incredible boards, and they're being ridden now by both expats and local Nicaraguans. And so there's there's a lot of positive stories. There's, of course, some less than positive stories, but one of the things that like I've seemed to talk most about post PhD, let's say, is the how surfing, these subcultures evolved and are now very much robust, and you have surfers, local surfers, competing internationally and doing well. And so I think that's, again, as I say, it's the beautiful sort of silver lining, if you will, of the whole story.
It sounds like there's more than just one silver lining. What you just mentioned to me here, again, coming from somebody who has never been immersed in this culture, I'm hearing almost a story of unicorns here. We have this beautiful magical outer reef where at different moments of the tide become these epicenters of either surfing or life-giving fishing. We also have these restaurants where authentic food is bringing together local and foreign cultures on top of artisan craft work and educational centers, even at something as seemingly small as a tent that actually has obviously international impact, because these educational initiatives and these moments of coming together on the land and sharing in a crafted surfboard and then sustaining your lives together through food, all of these are elevating individuals onto the international level with international spotlights. And that's magic. That's actual magic.
Yeah. And again, I want to be very, very careful here to our listeners, and to my research. Um, you know, we have to view this with a critical lens as well. And so it's not necessarily a utopia by any stretch of the imagination. There are, again, you've been asking me about some of the more positive attributes, let's say, of this surf tourism economy, and I'm certainly happy to talk about those. But I do want to be very, very straightforward and say it's not all, rainbows and unicorns and butterflies. And so, particularly those that are left out of the surf tourism economy, or in a case where COVID, when the people that rely heavily on this surf tourism, there's no one showing up to go to these restaurants too. So there's, of course, again, we have to always view this through a critical lens, through an objective lens, and say, while there are beautiful stories that have emerged and locals that are beneficiaries of this surf tourism economy, there are others who have been marginalized, who have been left out, and we've seen this model take place in places like Jaco, Costa Rica, and others, and that when you have that sort of dichotomy and people are left out or people struggle to make ends meet, they then engage in more illicit behaviors. And so again, I talk about that stuff as well in my dissertation. So I do want to be fair and critical, and as to not paint this utopian picture of this place. And so so that I just wanted to add that caveat.
Absolutely. I think it's so important to make sure we examine the effects any of us are having from a truly balanced perspective. Somebody coming from outside of the culture, I hear some of these things, especially through entrepreneur brain, and I can get very excited about the opportunities and things, but especially with some of the stories that you've gathered some of the stories that you've lived, you can see that everything is truly balanced, and when something is great, there's going to be an equal yet opposite reaction, as per the laws of physics.
Yeah. And there's, again, there are a lot of, you mentioned some of the business stuff. There's nonprofit work going on. There are wonderful groups doing things there. And, again, I want to, my goal with this dissertation, and much thanks to the guidance of my committee members, of course, I was able to write a more objective and fair story, not just a highlight reel, if you will, because that's not very academic, and that's certainly not going to earn me a PhD. That might be a fun book, people want to read, and but that was not my goal. My goal, and again, with the guidance of my committee, who were extremely helpful, I was able to view this little place in the world through a more critical lens than just, like I said, this happy story.
Right on.
And so but I do, at the same time, I wanted it to be something that, and I told my friends there, like something we could be proud of, something that it was never written before. And I wanted to take this opportunity to write it so that we can all, I say be proud of it. I don't know if that's the right thing to say, but something that both people living there can have as like a life story of sorts, but also, as I mentioned earlier in this episode, a platform or a point of departure for future scholars, because I think this is a wide open place for research. It's a beautiful place, and I think from archaeologists to people in tourism studies to geologists to the list goes on and on and on. So I'm just one small drop in a large ocean of research.
Jason, thank you so much for sharing just even just scratching the surface with us on the years-long research that you were doing, and the incredible transformation, both good and bad, that you're seeing in the areas that you were so drawn to on a personal level. I think a lot of our listeners have been waiting patiently, if not anxiously, to hear a little bit more about your expertise and the stories that you were uncovering. So thank you for taking the time to come share your story with all of us. As is tradition for our podcast, I'm going to go ahead and give you the last word.
Taylor, I did see that coming. And, but I do, before I get into the last word, let me just thank you for doing this. It means a lot. And it's been kind of fun to be on the other side of the microphone. But, I also want to thank, of course, my committee members who were there the whole way. But also equally as important, the people in Nicaragua, my expatriate friends, my local friends, this would not have been possible. We would not be sitting here if it weren't for all of them and their stories, triumphs and tribulations, and entrusting me to write this story. And so I am really, really forever grateful for everyone who has helped me to write this. And I really hope that, it serves as the building block for other future research. If you were stoked on this conversation with Taylor and I about my research and the history of surfing in Nicaragua, I'd like to invite you to check out our next episode, where I'll be joined by sociology professor Dr. Kristen Lawler. Kristen and I have a killer episode planned. We'll be talking about her book, The American Surfer, Radical Culture and Capitalism. We'll also be chatting about an essay she wrote on the Nietzschean connections between early 20th century surfers and the hobos of the industrial workers of the world. That essay is in a forthcoming book titled Roll and Flow, The Political Ontology of Surfing and Skateboarding. And to top it all off, I'll be getting her thoughts on the current state of critical surf studies, a field we're both part of. If those topics pique your interest, this will undoubtedly be an episode you won't want to miss. We also want to take a moment to thank Banana Bag Oral Solution again for sponsoring this episode. Don't forget to check them out at bananabag.org. And while you're there, use promo code STAYSTOKED for 10% off your purchase. Be sure to join their mailing list too if you want free shipping. Thanks for joining us for another episode of The Surfing Historian. If you're stoked on these conversations, be sure to share, like, and subscribe to never miss an episode. And don't forget to check out our killer merch at surfinghistorian.com. Proceeds go to help keep this amazing podcast going strong. Until next time, stay stoked.